Have you ever heard the claim that the Hebrew vowels were invented by the Masoretes? Today, we're exploring the historical evidence to dispel this common misconception. Welcome back to Talmidei Yehoah. I'm Moriah Ben Avraham, and today we are going to address a widespread misunderstanding. Did the Masoretes invent Hebrew vowels? We'll uncover the historical and linguistic truths behind this myth. First, let's be very clear about something fundamental. Spoken languages cannot exist without vowels. Vowels are just crucial to pronunciation and intelligibility. Imagine trying to speak, just cut the vowels out of an English sentence and try to speak that sentence without any vowels. Or maybe just add in only two vowels. Just You see how difficult it would be to actually communicate anything that you're trying to say. You need vowels to have an intelligible language, a functioning language. However, written languages can and often did omit vowels. Ancient Hebrew, just like ancient Egyptian, was recorded using just the consonants, relying heavily on oral tradition for accurate reading or pronunciation of what was recorded. Remember, language, speech, is not what's written. When we first communicated, we didn't communicate by writing first. We communicated first by speaking. Language is spoken, and speech always includes vowels. But once we started recording what we said, the ancients found it useful not to actually include the vowels, to leave the vowels out, because the people who were listening and who recorded it knew what the vowels were. So it was, let's say, a shorthand, if you will, to just write the consonants, which carried the full depth of the meaning. The meaning is locked in the consonants. The consonants don't change. The consonants are like constants. They don't change. The vowels are like variables. Now, without variables, the language itself, or what is written, is basically dead. It's not intelligible. No one can understand it. But once someone has the understanding of how the consonants should be vocalized, they can aspire, breathe life into the consonants and bring the text to life. And that's what was done in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian priests preserved secret vocalizations for their hieroglyphic texts, guided through precise hand gestures known as Cheironomy, used to indicate vocal and musical inflections. And through those hand gestures, the reader, usually there were two people, one who was gesturing and another who was vocalizing and inspiring, bringing life to the text, would be able to actually vocalize and bring life to the text when they deemed it necessary to actually share the message of the text with a public audience. The ancient Hebrews, who spent significant time in Egypt, as you know, 430 years, they carried forward similar oral traditions, maintaining accurate pronunciation through vocal and gestural methods. So anciently, whenever the text was read, there would always be someone who was gesturing to indicate how the text could be vocalized, since the text was always written simply with the consonants. The consonants carry the main meaning. The vowels, which are added, aspired, breathed into the text, make the text intelligible, make the text something that you can understand and you can actually speak. You can't speak a string of consonants. You need the vowels to actually be able to speak. French musicologist Suzanne Haïk-Vantoura explained in her influential book, Musique de la Bible, that's like the music of the Bible, Révélée, that means revealed, that's the title of the book. She explained that the Hebrew cantillation marks did not originate from just an invention clear out of the blue from the sky by the Masoretes. Instead, what the Masoretes did, they understood the gestures that were being used. Those gestures looked familiar, and then what they did was actually develop a notation system that mirrored, in many ways, the very gestures that they had witnessed and seen as the text was read. In fact, she said, and I quote, "The written signs are a shorthand for a specific cheironomy derived directly from ancient Egyptian practices." The Masoretes didn't invent vowels between the 6th and 10th centuries. That's when they did their work. But rather, they developed an elaborate system to preserve an existing oral tradition of pronunciation and cantillation extending over several centuries. They worked from the 6th to the 10th centuries of the Common Era. And their meticulous work codified precise vocalizations using symbolic marks and documenting the existing oral and gestural traditions. The Masoretes created a system of notation to preserve the pronunciation and cantillation of the Hebrew text, spanning from the 6th through the 10th centuries of the Common Era. I can't stress that point enough. No one who understands the work of the Masoretes thinks that they invented sounds. They didn't invent the O sound. They didn't invent the E sound. They simply invented a system of notating how the text was being vocalized for centuries, not just a small amount of time. They were guarding the oral traditions, what they heard, what was being heard for hundreds and hundreds of years. So now you might be asking yourself, well, why were the Masoretes intent on preserving the tradition of how every word should be pronounced and even chanted? Why was that necessary? Couldn't we have just kept the consonants as it was in ancient times, in times of old? Well, there was a danger. They began to realize that there were efforts afoot to intentionally mispronounce words to change the meaning. And as those responsible for preserving the tradition of how every word should be pronounced and the meaning of the text realized the danger that was coming, they decided to gather a large group of scholars and scribes. And that's when they came up with this system of notation. I'll give you one example of a verse that they were attempting to pervert. Shemot chapter 3, and we're going to look at verse 13. Let's start in verse 13. Here it says, and I'm going to read it in Hebrew first. In fact, I'm even going to chant it so you understand the precise way the text is supposed to be read. It says, Vayomer Moshe El HaElohim Hine Anochi Ba El Bnei Yisrael V'amarti Lahem Elohei Avotechem Shelachani Aleichem Ve'amru Li Ma Shemo Ma Omar Alehem. And Moshe said to Elohim, behold, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the Elohim of your father's house has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Verse 14, Vayomer Elohim El Moshe Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh Vayomer Ko Thomar Livnei Yisrael Ehyeh Shlachani shalachani aleichem. And Elohim said to Moshe, I will be what I will to be. In other words, and by the way, many translators translate this in a terrible way. Instead of saying ehyeh as to be, which it is the future tense or the imperfect tense, but we can think of it as the future. I will be what I will to be is a better translation. Some translators went with the present tense and just said, I am what I am. It's not I am, it's I will be. Yahweh is saying, I can be anything. My attribute, because a name in Hebrew is always descriptive. He said, why are you asking me? I can be whatever I will to be. But he didn't stop there. Verse 15, he went on and he said, Vayomer od Elohim el Moshe kotomar el bnei Yisrael Yehovah Elohei avotechem Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov shalachani aleichem ze shmihi leolam veze zichri ledor dor. And Elohim said more, ode, further to Moshe. He says, thus shall you say to the children of Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, Yehovah. Yes, that's the name of the Creator. Yehovah. He said, Yehovah, the Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Avraham, the Elohim of Yitzchak, and the Elohim of Yaakov has sent me unto you. This is my name, Le'olam, forever. This is my name forever. Wezeh Zikri, this is my memorial for all generations. Now I'm going to go back to this word here, Le'olam. This is my name, Zeshmi Le'olam. I'm going to turn now to another way of reading this text. I'm going to show you something that's online. It's called a tikkun. Now, a tikkun online, normally you have a book that's a tikkun, but I'm just going to bring here a virtual copy of it so you can see this online. And this tikkun is used as one is preparing to read, because one thing that the people who carry this myth don't understand, they think that in a Beit Knesset, or that's the Hebrew way of saying a synagogue, that people are reading from a text that has the Masoretic notation. And they are just totally ignorant of the fact that that's not the case at all. In any Beit Knesset, when the Torah is read, it's read from a scroll. And that scroll doesn't have any vowels. It doesn't have the vowels. It doesn't have any of the Masoretic notations. It's just the consonants. It's only the consonants. That's what's preserved in the scroll. And for anyone to read that correctly, and as it's being read, there are others who are looking at the Masoretic text to ensure that what is being vocalized matches what the tradition says. Others are looking at the text that has the vocalization, but the person reading is just looking at the bare bones, so to speak, the consonants alone. This tool, which is called a tikkun, which the word tikkun is a Hebrew word that means to repair, enables someone to prepare themselves or repair their memory, because maybe they forgot a little bit how to pronounce something. So instead of them going up and making mistakes, they get repaired. They use this book to practice the reading. And essentially what one can do is simply switch between seeing the vowels and not seeing the vowels. If you had it in a paper form book, on one side of the page, let's say the right side, you would be seeing the text with the vowels and the notations of exactly how the text should be chanted. But then on the other side of the page, which on the virtual tikkun, you just click the button again, it toggles, and now you're seeing it exactly the way it will appear in the scroll, that is, without the vowel marks. So this is the way people prepare to read the text. And unfortunately, many people are simply ignorant of how this whole system works. So when you're reading it without the vowels, someone could actually mistake the text. Instead of saying lit olam, someone could say lit alam. Let me show you that specific section. Notice it here. It says Ze shmi lit olam, with Ze zikri lit dor. Notice without the vowels, one might pronounce it as lit olam, but someone could come in and say lit alam. And this is exactly what began to happen. There were scrupulous folks, deceivers, who wanted to hide the name. The difference between olam, which means forever, this is my name forever, Ze shmi le olam means this is my name forever. But if you say Ze shmi le alam, that changes the entire sentence, and now it's saying this is my name to be hidden. And so there were people out there who don't want the name of the Creator to be known. They want to hide the name of the Creator. So in an attempt to hide the Creator's name, they began to mispronounce this word. They began to say Lit Alam. And this was one of the inspirations for the group of scholars and scribes to come together and say, we must come up with a system of notation to preserve and protect the correct pronunciation of the Torah forever. And that's why they did the work that they accomplished, where they came up with a system of notation, not inventing vowels. The vowels were always in use. We're going to see more evidence of that as we continue. So who were these Masoretes? Who were these scribes and scholars that came together to create this system of notation? They were a group of scholars and scribes chosen for this task of preserving the Masorah. The Hebrew word Masorah means tradition. It's the traditional way the text was chanted and read. Let's turn to the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible and see the article on Masoretic accents, which will help us get a more complete understanding of the work of the Masoretes. In this article, it says the Masoretic text of they say Old Testament, as we know, it's the Tanakh, contains accents of punctuation and other signs endowed with phonetic and musical meanings. Their significance for the proper reading of the text has been differently evaluated, from total neglect. So some people, they just want to neglect it altogether. They may have political reasons. They may have reasons to want to avoid what was being indicated by the Masoretes, meaning they want to go ahead and say that things should be hidden or misinterpret the text. And if the text is giving a clear indication of how something should be read and they don't agree with it, well, that's a reason for them to not want to go along with it. So that's the side of total neglect, to high esteem by the Delchits and Berliner. Now, they go on to say here, two systems of accents are known: that of the 21 prosaic books and the system of the three so-called poetic books, Psalms, Iyov, and Mishle. The function of the Masoretic accents is at least twofold, and in many cases threefold. Now, I'm not going to take the time to read this whole article, but I did want to get to the first point here that they're making. They constitute a most exact and intricate system of rhetoric punctuation of the Masoretic text. Problems of proper punctuation have frequently influenced the tradition of biblical exegesis. And again, he's using words that, generally speaking, we try to avoid, like the word Bible. That's just a word that means, in my mind, confusion, where you're joining disparate books together that don't even belong together. And if you don't understand that, I encourage you to watch the series of videos I did on the key to understanding the word of Yah, where we break down why mixing books leads to confusion, leads to misunderstanding. We need to understand each book separately, and we need to understand the importance of what has been revealed from the lens of what is most concrete. what is the most clear revelation, and that's, first of all, what Yahweh spoke himself, the 10 matters, Aseret HaDvarim in Hebrew. Then the next level would be the Sefer HaBrith, the words of the very covenant that Yahweh made with his people, Yisrael. That's what we find in Shemoth chapters 20 through 23. So the Sefer HaBrith would be the next most important set of words that have ever been revealed that Moshe wrote down. Al Pi Yahweh, by the mouth of Yahweh, by the hand of Moshe. And then finally, the other words that were penned by Moshe. Whatever Moshe wrote down, those carry more weight. So we would go further with all that Moshe wrote in the book of Shemot, and then the book of Vayikra, and then the book of Bamidbar. You might know those as Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. These are the more important words, and everything else sort of follows after that. But each book should be thought of separately. There's no combining of books. You don't take disparate books and mix them together and try to make one thing. That is not what we should be doing with the sacred Hebrew text. Think of each book as its own thing as it was written. They weren't written as one book. So the word Bible is a loaded word that we generally try to avoid. But when we think about that in this context here, and he's saying, okay, this has frequently influenced the tradition of, let's say, Tanakh exegesis. And by exegesis, they're saying the message that emanates from the text itself. Like what was in the text, not what you're reading into the text. Because a lot of people, when they use the text, they're not looking to see what the text, what message is coming out of the text. What was the author actually saying? Many people, when they read the text, they have their own idea of what they want the text to support. And so they are looking to use the text to just support their own ideas. That's not the right way to study the text. We want to hear what Yahweh is saying, and so we should let the text speak for itself. So if we want to let the text speak for itself, then you have to actually know how the text was speaking. How did it sound? What was it saying? And that's what's captured in the vocalization and even the cantillation, exactly how it was chanted. Now, this is a clear example. That's Yeshayahu, chapter 40, verse 3, what many know as Isaiah. Again, we try to restore the correct Hebrew names whenever we make reference to them, because that's respect. We want to show respect and not use slave names for the prophets. So, Yeshayahu chapter 40, verse 3, the Masoretic accents determine the punctuation thus. Notice the difference here. A voice cries, in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh. As opposed to, a voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh. The difference here is the voice in the wilderness, or is the voice telling whoever it's speaking to go into the wilderness? The correct way, the way the Masoretes preserve the punctuation through the cantillation marks, is that the colon that separates a voice cries from the latter, whatever the message is that's being cried, that colon is supposed to be right after the word cries. A voice cries, colon, quotation mark. In the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh. That means the message is telling the people to go in the wilderness to prepare the way of Yahweh. But the incorrect way, which, by the way, the incorrect way is what we actually find in the Greek text. Like whoever wrote the Greek text misunderstood the fundamental Hebrew text they were copying from, because they said a voice cries in the wilderness, referring to, one John the Baptist, they called him. They were saying he's in the wilderness. Right? A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh. Very different meaning. And so we need to understand these differences so we can understand how this can be, you can walk away with a totally incorrect understanding of the text if you don't understand the traditional way it was chanted. Let me read this for you in the Hebrew, just so you can get a sense of how it was chanted, how it would have sounded. Here's the verse, and there is a different style for reading the Nevi'im than when we read the Torah. So I will read it with that style of chanting. Ko kore bamidbar panu derech Yehovah Yashiru Ba'arava Mesila Lelohenu. So notice the way that was chanted. Ko kore. Pause. You see? Ko kore. The voice cries. And then what he cries is what follows. The cantillation marks actually look just like a colon, actually. You see this cantillation mark here? So that is literally looks like a colon, and it serves the purpose here as a colon. A voice cries. Ko kore. That's part of what he's crying. Whatever followed is what he's crying out. Yes, this is very different than what many of us have thought. Remember, the Masoretes were a group of scribes and scholars that were selected to preserve the traditional way the Torah was being chanted for centuries. They didn't invent vowels. They were preserving the tradition. They just came up with a system of notation. Even the chanting wasn't new. The chanting was being done all along, going all the way back, as Haïk-Vantoura pointed out in her book. The Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible article understands that to some degree, not as to the depth that Haïk-Vantoura does in her book, but they do point to the same thing. Notice it here. As this article continued, when we get down to point 4 of the article, which was on the next page, it says, cantillation of the Hebrew text. Masoretic accents have preserved the traditional features of ancient cantillation, a practice which was used long before the destruction of the temple in the Common Era of 70, and probably went back to Ezra himself in the 4th century before the Common Era. And again, that's where, let's say, the authors of this article would not have the same depth of an understanding as Helen did in her book, because she takes it even further back, all the way back to Egypt. But just continuing here with the understanding that these authors had, we're still saying that this chanting was going on for hundreds of years before any Masoretes came together to do anything. So they didn't invent the chanting. They simply came up with a system of notating and recording and documenting the chanting. It says here, the cantillation of scripture was governed by grammatical rules, syntactic analysis, and the interpretation of the text. The study of the Masoretic accents and of their significance for the cantillation of the text is therefore of extreme importance for the exegesis, that means the understanding of what's coming out of the text, of the Masoretic text. The practice of chanting biblical text antedates by many centuries the establishment of the Masoretic accents. As we know from early Tannaitic literature, since a rabbinic discussion in the Talmud, Megillah 32a, takes cantillation for granted and even closes with the categorical dictum, whoever reads scripture without melody and the Mishnah without chant, to him applies the biblical verse, I gave them laws which were not beautiful, quoting from the prophet Yechezkel's works, his book, chapter 20 and verse 25. Yechezkel being the Hebrew way of saying Ezekiel. And this is powerful stuff. This shows many of us, I remember when I first learned about this, I humbled myself because I was so ignorant prior to learning this. I had to admit that I really thought I knew the scriptures. And then I had to admit, wow, there's so much that I did not know. I stopped teaching for a long time. After I read this back in 1998, I think it was 1998, 1999, somewhere in that time frame. I stopped teaching because I had to humble myself and realize there's so much I don't know. Yes, this is deep stuff. This is heavy. Now, when we think about the meticulous work that these scribes did, and I'm going to even focus on the word scribe for a moment. The scribe is an English word that comes from Latin that has to do with writing. But the Hebrew way of referring to these same people is not the word scribe that focus on the writing. It's the word sofer. And sofer is a word that's connected with counting. It's connected with numbers. Misparim is numbers. So the idea here is that these scribes, and I'm going to quote from the Babylonian Talmud, Kiddushim 30a, the scribes are called the counters of the letters. The Sopharim are called the counters of the letters because they counted every letter of the Torah. To preserve the accuracy, what they did, they counted every letter. Every letter has a mathematical value, Aleph being 1, Beit being 2, all the way down. So they would add up each line, literally adding up. And then if the text doesn't add up, there's something wrong with the text. Like they know what a paragraph adds up to be. So at the end of writing a paragraph, this sofer was required to add it up. Does it match the count? If it's wrong, if it doesn't add up, whether by sum or by count, well then there's something wrong with the way you copied it. Throw it out or redo. A redo is necessary. This is a means by which they kept accuracy. And beyond that, they even took note of the middle word and the middle letter of words. They were absolutely fanatical in trying to preserve the accuracy of this text. And this is so important because think about it. How could we, who were carried away into captivity, how could we, who Yahweh said, I'm going to hide my face from you, ever return to Yahweh if he allowed his word to be corrupted beyond repair, where we had nothing to trust in? We'd have no way of returning, no way of doing teshuvah. But Yahweh put it in the hearts of those scholars and soferim, scribes if you will, to be very meticulous in how they copied script after script into new scrolls. As an old scroll got worn out and they copied it into a new scroll, they made sure that the copy was accurate, that everything added up. And that's how Yahweh preserved his word so that we can now read it and do the return to Teshuvah in this very day. Dr. Emmanuel Tove, a leading scholar of Hebrew Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls, explains, the Masoretes added the vowel signs and the accents above and below the text rather than in line in order to preserve the integrity of the traditional consonantal text, which was considered sacred and inviolable. Now, why are some people so adamant against the Masoretic text? It could simply be a lack of knowledge. Maybe they just haven't looked deeply enough into how languages work. It's possible. But it's also possible that it could be a desire to control. See, some people don't want you to learn Hebrew. They're going to constantly throw this stumbling block. Oh, why learn that Hebrew? It's polluted. They made up vowels. And they're going to stop you from trying to even learn Hebrew. Because if you do learn the Hebrew, they're going to lose control. You're going to begin to see what the Torah says for yourself. You won't have to rely on them or even anyone else for the translation. You can read what the original Hebrew was saying and understand it for yourself. You'll begin to hear what Yahweh himself is saying. because ultimately that's our goal. It's not to come up with our own ideas. It's not to read our ideas into the text or to understand someone else's ideas that have been read into the text. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is return to hear what Yahweh said, Al Pi Yahweh, by his own mouth, Al Pi Yahweh, Biyad Moshe, by the hand of Moshe. That's what we need to understand. And you should be able to read that and understand it for yourself in the Hebrew. That's part of what it means to do teshuvah. That's part of the whole process of return. Now, what's interesting, think about it now. Let's get deep. Let's take this all away. Those very people who are telling you don't learn Hebrew because they've added vowels, they created vowels. But then they'll quote scripture from an English translation. And where did that English translation come from? Is that English translation not also based on the very same Masoretic text? Of course it is. All English translations are based on the Masoretic text. All of them. Here's a chart. King James Version of 1611. Yes, it's based on the Masoretic text. The New King James Version. Yes, it's based on the Masoretic text. And NASB, ESV, NIV, CSB, Tanakh. Yes, it's all based on the Masoretic text. The TS 2009. Yes, it's based on the Masoretic text. All of the English translations are based on the Masoretic text. But you know what? If you can't read the Hebrew, you're stuck reading a translation. And when you're reading a translation, that means someone else learned to read that Hebrew and then with their own judgment, because not everything translates. There are things that just don't translate. There are things that you just can't get when you're reading it in English. So you're going to miss all of those clues, all of those hidden meanings, all of those hidden directives that Yahweh is really trying to speak to us because you're refusing to learn the Hebrew. You're not returning. You're not doing that part of the teshuvah. And instead, you're relying on, generally speaking, a lot of people that don't really know Yahweh to do the interpretation for you. And in many instances, they don't get it right. They get it wrong in a lot of ways. Recognizing the distinction between coming up with a system of notation versus inventing vowels helps us appreciate the accuracy and depth of the Hebrew vocal traditions and correct historical misunderstanding. So the next time you encounter the claim that the Hebrew vowels were invented by medieval scribes, remember, vowels always existed in speech. And the Masoretes' gift was preserving them meticulously over generations, not inventing them. If you enjoyed this video, do hit like and subscribe and share this with your friends. We need to help many people return to the true knowledge and to the capability of reading the text for themselves. Shalom, shalom.